Thank you, Chair, the panelists, the speakers, and the audience, both offline and online. A very good afternoon, konnichiwa. I'll be talking from the perspective of financing long-term recovery outcomes in a large country, a diverse country like India. We are a blessed country with evergreen forests and deserts and coastlines and Himalayas and mountains. But we also have all the curse of the natural disasters. So 60% land is earthquake-prone, 12% flood-prone, 68% drought-prone, 10%, 7,000 kilometers coastline is cyclone-prone, landslides and avalanche. 30% of the world's landslides occur in the Himalayas. So that is a mighty mountain to have. Forest fire, 35% of the land mass. So it's a large country and a lot of vulnerabilities that we have, but we are trying to learn both in the domain of response and relief. We have the National Disaster Management Authority looking at the planning perspective, the National Disaster Response Force, one of the best looking at the response. And we also have gone into the domain of recovery now. Next, please. So, before this, last year, 100% of the amount of the fund with the Government of India went to response and relief. Last year onwards, we have changed the trajectory, and that is what I call a good practice. We are trying to learn from that. 10% goes for community building and preparedness. 40% goes for response and relief. 20% goes for mitigation now onwards. And 30% is earmarked funds for recovery and reconstruction. So this we are doing internally within the union federal budget. But still, we have some constraints, and the constraints are immediate relief in a large country like India is a very dominant force. We have a financial space limitation. How do we build into long-term recovery is an important question to answer, the first point. The second is we are still worrying about economic losses. Capturing non-economic losses is a difficult domain, speaking from the field realities. We are still catching the damages. If we start looking at the intangible losses, they would go into billions of dollars, but assessment and financing of both is a red line. I put those words in red because that is where we are struggling to get into. We are capturing the extreme weather events from all perspectives, from early warning, dissemination of the messages, taking care of response in cyclones, but we are still not very fine with slow onset events like drought. We are still going into that area now. So this is the movement that has happened in the country last year. Everybody knows here the recovery cycle. I'll not go into this graph. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we have the 5-year planning process in India, and we have the 15th Finance Commission that has changed the funding structure forever. We have a National Disaster Risk Management Fund, and also at the prefecture level, the SDRMF. The NDRMF, which is the mitigation fund, is divided into response fund and mitigation fund both. Response fund takes care of 80% of the budget, mitigation fund 20%. And this 80% under the response fund is divided into 3 components. So it's good to be better prepared and have the better capacity to fight a disaster. Response and relief is still 40%, but we have in this domain of recovery reconstruction 30% of the funds available. Next slide. I'll not go into the numbers, but this is the fund available for 5 years. We are in the 2nd year now, $8,400 million available totally in this fund, clearly demarcated into very priority areas, including response, rehabilitation, and some priority areas like urban flooding, landslide risk management, erosion management, going into displacement of people because of erosion, expansion and modernization of the fire services, and many more. So we are building up national programs and national capacities, to name a few, on forest fires, on drought, on heat wave, on lightning and thunderstorm. So very important areas that we are using our limited budget in the Government of India. Next, please. So with the prior experience, we had only 2 experience in India when we talk about post-disaster needs assessment and looking at recovery and reconstruction plan. The first was the cyclone Fani in a prefecture or state called Odisha. So we calculated the total damage and losses. This was a 15-sector approach, 12 days multi-sectoral team, and the total quantification was $4,188 million. No external funding. It was totally internally funded. We tried to make up better resilient infrastructure, housing, and livelihood focus. So this was the first experience we had in post-disaster need assessment and also in recovery and reconstruction. Next, please. The second is in the south, another coastal state, Kerala, as they call it, God's own country, had massive floods. And we did the same thing, 14 sectors, 26 days PDNA was carried out. Total quantification was $4,400 million US. And an initiative called the Rebuild Kerala initiative was launched. External funding, ADB, World Bank, KfW, German, AIB, and some internal funding from internal organizations was done to make the Rebuild Kerala initiative. Next slide, please. So this year, what I'm coming from and sharing with all of you, in the floods that happened in 2022, in the 8 states or the prefectures, we thought we'll have internal capacity to do PDNA, not relying on external experts all the time. So this time we have attempted to do a PDNA exercise in-house with the government departments in the prefectures and 4 sectors: housing, education, wash, infrastructure, roads and bridges. And it's a great learning experience. It's actually looking at the capacities of the engineers to think about Build Back Better is a very interesting domain to get into. Next slide. So what are the challenges in financing recovery? One, obviously, is mortality has come down, but the livelihood loss is increasing in a country like India with the scale that we have. The second is exposure to disaster risk is growing across the country, with more and more urban areas coming up, which are unplanned and unregulated. We heard the Tokyo story, migration from rural areas to urban areas. So the risks are also growing up. Build Better and Build Back Better currently looks like contemporary myth and very utopian to talk about. Multiple disasters in a short span of time. India had 8 major disasters in 4 months. And concurrent demand for planning and financing at the same time is a problem. The third important point is cascading disasters. So when Kerala had floods, it also had one of the biggest landslides. And that then went into COVID. So multiple disasters happening together also draws both the financial and the manpower requirements. High economic cost. So infrastructure sector, most affected and more costly, and takes away most of the money. And social and the productive sectors still take a back seat in the PDNA and the recovery reconstruction plans. Immediate relief versus long-term planning, public assets versus individual assets and livelihoods, cross-cutting ideas like gender, governance, environment, DRR, livelihoods are talked about, are reflected in the last chapters of the PDNA report, but still don't have the kind of emphasis that they should have. Next, please. Challenges are limited capacities at the national and state level for doing PDNA and for doing the recovery reconstruction planning. We also have HR issues for Build Back Better. We don't have the kind of engineers and social sector guys who can draft a great plan. Mobilization, coordination, and allocation and fund flow. Once the funds start flowing, how do you mobilize the funds, but then you have the capacities to spend that and the regulatory framework for building better. We also have economic considerations. It is cheaper to build not better, and therefore a lot of buildings that are coming up across the country would not be qualifying to be called Build Better. So there is economic considerations, who takes the extra cost of building better and building back better. Mainstreaming and reallocation within the regular finances is a very important thing, and then audit, monitoring, evaluation, and oversight. The second last point is important because if we mainstream and reallocate our own resources within the regular finances, I think a lot of problems solved. We'll not have to talk about Build Back Better. If you start building better, would be the main thing. Next, please. So the process, we are drawing on the recovery programs implemented in India from across the world. We have now committed sources funding for recovery. We have activities under the recovery reconstruction window. It's very difficult to make people understand in the field that recovery reconstruction is different from relief and rehabilitation. So important. It is becoming an essential mandatory step. If you want to access funds from the federal government, you need to follow the PDNA process. Decentralization, we believe capacity at the state level and district level is limited. That needs to be increased. Next, please. So way forward looks like we need to have a recovery policy soon in India after this experience of 3 years. Institutional capacities for recovery need to be built. That is the most critical. Financial arrangements for recovery are very important to take care. But the second point is critical. Institutional capacities for recovery is is the thing to talk about. Sector-based technical expertise for recovery is very important. And we have been talking since morning about the capacities of implementing a program without having time overruns or the cost overrun. So overall, streamlining of the mechanism, planning, implementation, annual reporting, midterm review, performance indicators, outcomes for inclusive and faster build back better. In fact, building better is the way forward. Next slide, and the last slide. Yes, time is up. So this is a picture I borrow from a tragedy that we're facing right now, a beautiful mountain Himalayan town called Joshimath. Looks nice with the snow and the cold weather, but that is a badminton court on the right side, up figure, and there's a drawing room of an inhabitant there. So the whole town is shrinking, and the whole country is worried about this. So had we built better, I think we would not have to resort to build back better. Thank you so much for a patient hearing. Thank you.